Hello, students. Happy to be with you today. I've been having some computer issues, so it's already afternoon before I can get this to you. But I guess I feel like I should show you a picture of myself. Teachers have been saying how you need to see us, and I definitely need to see you. I am not cut out for this. But anyway, here we are. So I came up to school today because I've been working on your projects, and I'm trying to get those done and to you. So we're just going to finish up with the rest of the notes today. I want to get right into it on bipolar disorder. So now we're moving into a bit of a different realm between mood disorders and personality disorders. So bipolar disorder is, you've probably heard of the term, and you know what bipolar means. You know, bi and polar means two opposites. So it's when people have a severe depression alternating with manic episodes. Now, mania, or a manic type state, is when people are like on high energy levels. They are they have little need to sleep, or they have like overexcitement, very talkative. They're hyperactive. They can, and this is usually for could be hours to days. When you have a manic episode, you could go in this state for several days, actually, which means you're not sleeping for several days. You probably aren't eating correctly or taking care of yourself correctly, but you have this high amount of energy. Then comes a crash almost, and this is when you are in a severe depression, which is absolutely the opposite. Whereas before you had little need for sleep, now you almost sleep the entire time. You were over talkative, now you're like removing yourself from friends and family and society. So this is, and there's several different kind of levels, if you will, of bipolar disorder, but it can be treated. What we know is that those who have bipolar disorder are often very creative type people. You see Mark Twain there, Tim Burton, Virginia Woolf, she was a writer. Tim Burton was the guy who made Edward Scissorhands, The Nightmare Before Christmas, and we know that most people who are very creative thinkers have done their greatest work in these manic episodes. And again, it's probably not something that they look forward to, but it's also a very kind of where all of your energy is at the very pinnacle, peak of what you're experiencing. I just kind of threw this in there. This is a good term to know. It's called comorbidity. And when I was grading your projects, I'm noticing this over and over. It's the co-occurrence of two or more diseases or disorders. For example, maybe diabetes and depression. You have diabetes, and then you get diagnosed with your depression. Does depression make your diabetes worse, or does diabetes make your depression worse? So for instance, if you have a mood disorder and you have an addiction, what's usually going to be the case is that you have to treat the disease or the disorder that is most acute, that needs the most attention right away. So for instance, do you need to, if we go back to diabetes and depression, you need to maybe treat the diabetes, but in order to treat the diabetes correctly, you have to treat the depression, because the depression is stopping you from eating normal healthy foods, from taking your medications, from checking your insulin levels. So unless you get the depression under control, you can't really take care of the diabetes factor. So there's often a dual diagnosis. I want to real quick switch and go and show you this what I found the other day. Social anxiety disorder. So a lot of people, this is what people say: oh, I'm so socially anxious, I hate small talk. When what it's really like is, I really have to go to the bathroom, but I won't get up because everybody will stare. This is what people think, and then it's what people really know what it's like. bipolar disorder. This is what people say. Haha, you're so moody. It's like you're bipolar. What it's really like, you emptied your bank account to buy expensive boots. Oh, yeah, haha, I'm at school. It's first lunch. You emptied your bank account to buy expensive boots last week and didn't sleep for 3 days? Yep, and now I've been severely depressed because I can't stop thinking about the time I was mean to the lunch lady 8 years ago. That's bipolar. ADD, attention deficit disorder, what people say, I should be studying, but I'm just so ADD, and you see them playing video games there. What it's really like, I've been staring at this page for hours and cannot focus. Like, your brain does not work that way. It's got to be very frustrating. OCD, what people say, it's like, you're kind of OCD. Could you take off your shoes before you come in? I'm kind of OCD. What it's really like, I'm OCD. I have horrible thoughts of my family and friends dying in the fire, and the only slight relief I can get from this embarrassing ritual is that I know is irrational, turning the light switch on and off. I wouldn't wish OCD on my dearest enemy. So this is, people, don't take it lightly. If people are suffering with an illness, it's not necessarily what society thinks it is. Depression, what people say depression is, they're canceling my favorite show, I'm so depressed. What it's really like, you're laying in a dark room, in a bed, and you can't get out, and you're asking yourself, why am I alive? So I wanted to show that, what true instances of mental illness look like, rather than what people say they're like. So let's move on to personality disorders. This is maybe a little bit familiar to you when we watched that video on Helen, a very memorable video. Before we even get into DID, let's talk about dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative disorder. This is when you have a conscious awareness that you are dissociated or separated. You've come away from previous memories, thoughts, or feelings. You have this break from your sense of self. Now, I'm going to say I've had this, like, sometimes these surreal moments where I'm like, what is happening? I don't really even, I'm not living in reality here. This is weird. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching it. You have this unreal sense of being, this out-of-body sense of being, that you're kind of like watching yourself, and this is all happening. Now, that rarely happens to me. If it ever happens to you, chances are you don't have a dissociative disorder. This happens every now and then. It's when it starts interfering with your day-to-day life. Often it's because of a fugue state, that you have repressed some very, very painful memories or feelings. It's like amnesia. Now, amnesia is often caused by head trauma or a physical impairment, but it's this, you forget it. You repress these memories or thoughts or feelings and dissociate from them. So we've talked about identity disorder, dissociative identity. It used to be called multi-personality disorder, when you have two or more distinct identities. Now, one thing that I will say about this, it is very criticized in society, I guess I would say, because people are highly hypnotizable. People who have DID can be very hypnotizable, and then their authenticity of what they're really saying might not be true. And we know this because sometimes we've seen the therapists are actually the ones who are kind of driving the patient's thoughts and personalities. Part of what we have seen is because in the early 1980s, there were truly like a handful, like maybe 10 in the United States. And then this movie came out called Sybil, and I hope you can watch this little trailer of this video. But after this movie called Sybil came out, the cases exploded. I think it went up to like 20,000 in 1 year. So we go from like maybe 10 in the United States to, after this movie coming out, thousands and thousands of people saying they had DID. Now, what we very much know is that people who suffer with DID have faced some serious trauma. You know, that if you think back of the Helen video, I don't know if I can think of anything more traumatic. And so it kind of dissociates people to protect them from this overwhelming emotion, because they have to repress it. They cannot think about it because it's so traumatic. Personality disorders, I'm not going to go through all of these. They're very interesting. There's a picture of a narcissist right there. He was, this is an old video, or old personality disorder. I'm not going to go through all these, but know that it can impair your social functioning on some of these. The one that I do want to talk about is antisocial personality disorder, and this is the one that that's newsworthy. This is the weird stories, the scary stories that you hear when you hear of like the sociopath or the psychopath. What's interesting is that an antisocial personality disorder, the person is not necessarily what we would think of what the word antisocial means, that they remove themselves from society. Actually, quite the opposite. Antisocial personality disorder, people can be very charming. By the way, I should mention that it's often a man. Much higher ratios of men who exhibit antisocial personality disorder than women. But they are quite charming, easy to talk to, have normal lives, they hold down jobs, they have families, but they can be really very ruthless, very, very clever, and are con artists. In fact, this picture right here, he's called the BTK killer because his kind of trademark was to bind, torture, and kill his victims. And he had a family. He lived very much of a double life. His name was Dennis Rader. He lived in the suburbs of Kansas City. He even had a job in like criminal justice. So it was almost as if he's playing this cat and mouse game where he would do things to victims and then, lead on the authorities. So these are the newsworthy types of personality disorders, and luckily few and far between. All right, so let's move on to schizophrenia. This is the most probably important part of the last of the mental disorders, because schizophrenia is very different than any other disorder that we will ever talk about in our chapters, because it is not so much of a disorder as a disease. In fact, the word schizophrenia means split mind. And it's characterized by a lot of these different things this is different, again, than any other disorder that we've talked about. So things like delusions, which are false beliefs, hallucinations, which are false perceptions. You think you smell something, or you think you hear something. Disorganized speech, sometimes it's called word salad, where they are speaking, but there's just words jumbled together, like words thrown into a bowl and make no sense. Inappropriate emotional expressions, this is sometimes called flat affect, where they're just their faces shows no emotion whatsoever. Or the opposite of it could be inappropriate actions where, and I heard this, I think, on Noelle's project, they're laughing when they should be sad, or they're screaming when they should be happy, or things like that. So you could be catatonic as well, and that's when you are just completely immobile and you don't move in a kind of purposeless movement. So take a look at that Anderson Cooper link that I put in here. If you can't find it, if it for some reason is blocked, just type in on YouTube Anderson Cooper schizophrenia simulation. It's a really, really good 5-minute look at what schizophrenics have to deal with and what their life is like. Anderson Cooper gets to take off the headphones. Schizophrenics do not get to do that. One thing that I'd like you to add to your notes, some positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Now, I've said this many times, positive and negative do not mean good and bad. They mean closer to or further away, added to or taken away from. So positive symptoms of schizophrenia are things like hallucinations, delusions, inappropriate behavior. So you're adding something that is a symptom. So you're adding that you hear something. You're adding that you believe somebody is standing right next to you. Negative symptoms are those lack of feelings where you have kind of inappropriate actions, or catatonia. You have catatonia where you don't move, or flat affect where you're just completely expressionless. So keep in mind that there are negative symptoms and positive symptoms, but those don't mean good and bad. They mean added to or take away from. So the onset of schizophrenia is pretty much the same worldwide. We don't see a lot of cultural differences. It's about 1 in 100 people worldwide develop schizophrenia. It happens especially in younger people who are maturing into adulthood. People under the age of 18 are not diagnosed with schizophrenia, but we often see people who are in their 20s who experience stressful experiences. You know, you are in college and you're about to go off to college, or you're in college and you have to get an internship, or you're in college and you have to graduate and get a job, or maybe you're in young adulthood and you're going to get married. These are stressful experiences that can bring about schizophrenia. One thing that I'd like to say, that if symptoms of schizophrenia happen quickly, if there's a sudden onset, it's called acute. Oftentimes that might be because of trauma. There's a better chance of recovery or a return to so-called normalcy, rather than if it's a gradual onset. If it's a gradual onset and it's slowly happening over a course of years, it's likely to be chronic, and there's not as much chance of a recovery. Now, schizophrenia can be controlled to an extent, but never really cured, because it's really a very studied brain disease. We know so very little about it, which is why most of the research goes into trying to figure it out. So when we look at the brain abnormalities of schizophrenics, we know there's a strong biochemical key. Part of it is excess D4 dopamine receptors, and I think we've actually had a question about this before. Too much dopamine is one of the reasons for these kind of neurons to fire out of sync, and that triggers these symptoms. So what we've also seen is that, you remember when we've talked about antagonists? Antagonists block like these dopamine receptors, and that can lessen symptoms. So things like clozapine actually helps schizophrenia. However, on the opposite side of that, things like cocaine and nicotine and methamphetamines, amphetamines, those actually increase symptoms. So if you have schizophrenic tendencies, sometimes it's a little bit like schizoid disorders. If you have some tendencies of schizophrenia, especially if it's gradual onset and nicotine or drugs are abused, it's more likely to develop into schizophrenia. And it touches on many regions of the brain, which again is why we look at schizophrenia so differently than we do any other disorders, because it affects things like the prefrontal cortex, which we know is important in decision making and judgments. In our basal ganglia, we haven't talked a lot about basal ganglia, but that's in like our motor movements and our motor habits. In our limbic system, which is important for emotion regulation. So it affects many regions of the brain. There's some evidence to suggest that it might have happened in Pregnancy, during mid-pregnancy, if a mother would develop a viral infection or the flu, there's quite a bit of genetic predisposition in twin studies. If you are an identical twin and your twin has schizophrenia, there is a strong correlation that you, if you are an identical twin, may also develop schizophrenia. So we know that there is some genetic link here. And that's actually the last thing that I want to talk about, specifically with schizophrenia, but all actual mental disorders as well. So some environmental and behavior influences. Now this last slide is about schizophrenia, but I'm going to kind of connect it to the disorders of the chapter. There's some possible warning signs. If a mother is schizophrenic, there are birth complications, if there's a short attention span, emotional unpredictability, poor peer relations, things like that. Those are warning signs, if you will, of schizophrenia. Doesn't mean that you're schizophrenic. However, that's when we talk about the word epigenetics. And epigenetics is so we have these genes, right? In our DNA, we have these genes that express themselves. And so rather than like an alternate genetic code, it kind of modifies itself. So let me put it to you this way. Just because in whether it's schizophrenia or any mental disorder, just because there might be some the nature-nurture debate, just because there might be some of these issues that we are born into, we didn't ask for them, it just happened that way, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to come out. But given the environmental influences, could it be sped up? Could it show itself and be modified in your genetic code? So let me give you an example. You have a tea bag, right? And the tea bag means nothing. Like, it's a tea bag. It has the potential to be tea, but there's nothing to it until hot water is added to it. The hot water is what activates the tea. That's how you need to look at disorders, including schizophrenia. The environment may have a very large impact on your genetic predisposition. You might have some of these risk factors, but it does not mean that you are going to be schizophrenic. Maybe you have risk factors for being diagnosed with depression, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be depressed. Sometimes I think about it like, I heard one time a teacher that I had said, well, no hand claps alone. Like, you have a hand and it has the potential to clap, but it needs two hands to clap. Like, I guess I could slam it on a desk, but that, doesn't really do anything. That's not a clap. So think about that, how once again, it's the nature-nurture debate. How much does the environment very much activate or influence our mental disorders, including things that are the most complicated, like schizophrenia? So that's the end for today. Thank you for hanging with me. It was a bit of a longer one. I can tell you next week we're going to be kind of shifting gears and we'll take a test, and it's just going to be an FRQ test. It's going to be short and sweet and easy to go with. So until we meet again, talk to you later. Bye.